Scientists have found plastic in human hearts, blood, lungs, placentas, and even brains. We've created a material that never truly disappears. It just gets smaller and smaller until it ends up inside us. Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Toman, and this is Three Takeaways. On Three Takeaways, I talk with some of the world's best thinkers, business leaders, writers, politicians, newsmakers, and scientists. Each episode ends with three key takeaways to help us understand the world and maybe even ourselves a little better. Today, I'm excited to be with Dr. Matthew Campen. He's a professor at the University of New Mexico and the director of the New Mexico Center for Metals in Biology and Medicine. He's a toxicologist, and his research is changing how we think about plastic as a public health threat. His team developed a new way to measure plastic particles, hundreds of times smaller than the width of a human hair. And what they found is alarming. They detected microplastics in every human brain they tested. Even more disturbing, brain tissue from people with dementia contained up to 10 times more plastic than human brains. And this problem is accelerating. The amount of plastic found in human brains increased by 50% between 2016 and 2024. Welcome, Matt, and thanks so much for joining Three Takeaways today.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Lynn.
My pleasure, Matt. Let's start simple. When people hear microplastics or nanoplastics, what are we actually talking about?
Well, the plastic objects that you deal with in your life, whether they're your plastic bags or the coffee maker or your bumper of the car, those are things that are macroplastics. They're big, they're not a health hazard immediately, but they will eventually be thrown away. And once they're thrown away, they're going to start degrading in the environment. The UV light from the sun and oxygen from the atmosphere will break those chemicals down slowly, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually they become what we call microplastics. And we define that as a scale based on how physically big the diameter of those particles is. From 1 micrometer to 5 millimeters is usually how it's defined. And then they can break down smaller into the nanoplastic scale, which is now smaller than the cells of your body. And a lot of what we've seen, they're actually the size of viruses.
You developed a new way to measure plastic in human tissue. What makes your approach different?
Well, a lot of the conventional research in and around the field of microplastics was using a visual means of detection. And that means they use a microscope with a laser, and that laser reveals a spectra from the plastic, which is a very chemically specific way of finding them. But the problem with that is there's limits to the size. You can't go very small with that technology. And we needed something that would allow us to look at those nanoscale things that are actually getting across our intestinal tract. So the reason our system, it's called pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry. What that does is it's sort of a cumulative picture of all the plastic that we can isolate from the body or from a tissue. The reason it's important from our standpoint is we want to eventually link whether or not the plastics in your body associate with health outcomes. We measure cholesterol in a mass concentration. You talk to your primary care physician and they give you a number that's a milligrams per deciliter. They don't tell you how many numbers of cholesterol molecules you have. So that was sort of the problem with the plastics studies that had been done until our group started doing this pyrolysis system. A number of other groups are doing it now too. It's really catching on. But counting the number of plastics and saying, oh, we saw 5 plastic particles, it doesn't really lend itself well to population health studies.
When you tested brain samples, you found plastic in every single one. How much plastic are we talking about?
We've put out there this idea that there's a plastic spoon of material in your brain. That's a horrible way to phrase it because there's a lot of uncertainties in the way we measure this. Plastics, when they get this old, because that's what's happening, is they're degrading over decades before they get into our body. They're so old, they don't chemically look the same as they used to. So there's a lot of assumptions we've made. Head to head from one group to another, I think it's very fair to compare between groups with this method. So when you said there was a 50% increase over 8-year period, I think that's a very valid conclusion from our method. But when we talk about absolute mass of plastic, it's really difficult to make that assumption with our method. It's going to vary from person to person, and different plastics will reveal themselves more confidently than others. So, about 5 grams or so is what we were estimating. I think right now we're still just befuddled that there's plastic in our brain, period, right? Where we sampled in the original study was from the frontal cortex. There's reasons for that. The frontal cortex is sort of what makes us human. It gives us the ability to think, and it's something that humans have in greater proportion than any other animal. And it's also the center of a lot of diseases like dementia. So we assessed from there, but now what we've done is we've mapped out an entire hemisphere. And the frontal cortex is very clearly the highest concentration compared to the rest of the brain. So the analogy I like to make is if we were to estimate the entire population of this country by taking a random sample of the population density of Manhattan, you would severely overestimate the population of the country. So that's where we are right now. We're still working through the method as well as trying to understand the distribution through the brain and other organs of the body.
The amount of plastic in human brains that you tested increased 50% in just 8 years. What do you think is driving that rise?
Everything we are looking at suggests it has to do with the amount of plastics in our environment. We have been making more and more plastics since the 1950s. The amount of plastics we create doubles every 10 to 15 years or so, so it is an exponential curve. And the delay from when we make the plastic to decades later when that plastic gets thrown out and it becomes micro and nanoplastic, you're talking about a 30 or 40, 50-year delay between the creation to the formation of these nanoplastics that get into your body. Everything we're looking at says the increase in our brain just completely mirrors that increase of our exposure. But that leads to the biggest concern we have, which is if we figure out that plastics are bad for our health, we need to make decisions about plastics policy now to affect our grandchildren. The curve of increasing micro and nanoplastics is not going to stop just because we stop making plastics.
You found microplastics in many organs of the body, but the brain had the highest concentrations. Why do you think that is?
There's a number of hypotheses we have. Probably the biggest one is that the brain, pound for pound, is the most metabolically active organ of our body. We suspect that these plastics are being delivered through the circulation, through your blood. And your brain, despite being only 1.5 kilograms, so about 3 or 4 pounds of your body, it receives 30% of your blood flow. Your brain demands energy and it demands resources all the time. So we think that's probably the main reason. The other aspect is the brain has a really bad clearance system. You know, your liver and your kidney are designed for clearance. They remove toxins from your body. But the brain has sort of this privileged space in your skull, and it uses, we call it the glymphatic system because it combines like a lymphatic system with the glial cells. It's complicated, but ultimately, things have a potential to build up because that clearance pathway from the brain is not as robust as other organs.
Brain tissue from people with dementia had up to 10 times more plastic than healthy brains. What do you think is happening here?
Our study was cross-sectional, and that means it's associative. It's a chicken or egg issue, so we're not prone to jumping to the conclusion that plastics cause dementia. Dr. Alzheimer diagnosed his first case in, I want to say 1902 or 1907 or something like that, way before there were plastics on this earth, right? What happens in dementia is that your blood vessels become leaky. The blood-brain barrier, as we call it, tends to become impaired. And anatomically speaking, is that there does seem to be a buildup of little plastic particles in and around the blood vessels. And then again, to the clearance aspect, dementia is a disease where the clearance is impaired and proteins and other things are building up. We also see plastics in and around areas of inflammation within the immune cells that are trying to clean up things in the brain. So it's very possible that the disease of dementia simply creates a really welcoming environment for the plastics to absorb into. So we have to be really thoughtful about what we have seen and what we have shown with this latest research.
What do we actually know about what these plastics are doing once they're inside our bodies?
We don't know much. Plastics are very inert. We like to use the term harmful or safe as absolute terms, but I'm a toxicologist, and in our world, everything is potentially a toxicant at a certain dose. We put stents into coronary arteries that are made out of plastic, and they give people life. They give people years and decades of life after a angioplasty. Plastic parts are used for hip replacement and other devices that can be put inside the body. So we have to be aware that plastics are used because they're inherently something that the body doesn't respond to. But once they've broken down, once they've degraded, there's a different chemistry about them, and there's a lot we just don't know. So, could these aged plastics from the environment that get into our agricultural system somehow, could those have a different overall response? Potentially. Colleagues at Duke have shown that they can cause aggregation of proteins in the brain. We've seen that they can alter the behavior of immune cells. We've seen that they can be obstructive to flow. So, in situations like erectile dysfunction, they may physically get in the way of blood flow into the penis. There could be a lot of other immune or biochemical reactions that we just haven't studied yet. There is one study suggesting that plastics can induce coagulation that leads to infarction, stroke type of an outcome in the brain. We're not seeing that in the population. You would think that if that was really going on, we'd be seeing devastating public health effects already. I really don't think that that's very realistic. But the other thing that I think is a difficult space to talk about right now, but cell to cell connections, could these be interfering with the way neurons talk with other neurons, especially in the developing brain? It's a really interesting hypothesis, and I think research is needed urgently in and around that space.
How is plastic getting into our bodies in the first place? Is it food, water, or air?
Our research right now says it's food. We haven't published everything, and we're staring at this data knowing that it'll cause a bit of a kerfuffle, I'm sure. But processed foods, processed meats seem to have the highest amount of plastic. When you compare a beef stick, really highly processed meat, versus venison that was harvested out in the Gila Mountains of New Mexico, there's just magnitudes different levels of plastic. And I think it might be the glues and the other parts of the processing that happens and adds those plastics. We don't know yet. There's so much we don't know. Right now, and this is unpublished, when looking at polypropylene from our assessment, which is one of the readouts we have more confidence in, venison, maybe 10 micrograms per gram, really quite low. We go to grass-fed beef and it's like 12 to 15. Chicken is 15 to 20, still in the same ballpark. But when we get to processed pork or beef stick, we're now talking about 300 or 400 micrograms per gram. The industrial raised beef, it was more in the 40 to 50 microgram rate, so maybe 5 times compared to the grass-fed beef, but not nearly as high as what happens when you do the processing of the meat. We haven't been able to do head-to-head comparisons between meat and vegetables because we have to process those differently in our methods. But our conjecture right now is that vegetables are going to be lower concentration and safer. Water doesn't really register quite as high. And inhalation is just so very small concentrations that you're breathing into your body compared to what's in the food. That's where we are right now with that science.
Are you seeing high levels in water?
Not as much. We think what's happening is we're really focusing plastics into our food chain. The water that we drink is actually quite low in plastics relative to what we're seeing in meats. So we have a hunch, this hasn't been tested out, but we tend to clean all the wastewater of our municipalities, of our cities around the country in conventional wastewater treatment plants that use sludge. And that sludge is actually really good for cleaning out the microplastics. Problem is, we tend to take that sludge out on a routine basis and use it in agriculture because it's really wonderful as a fertilizer. So are we just taking the entire municipality's microplastics and focusing it into the fields of our nation? And I don't know the answer to that, but there's evidence that suggests that yes, agricultural pathways are a dramatically underappreciated source of microplastics. All the things that we throw away ultimately break down and get into the groundwater or get into the environment in other ways. A lot of the plastic story we think of as the ocean plastics. I think it's because they were discovered in the ocean. You know, Richard Thompson and scientists from the UK discovered these, published in 2004, I should say. I'm sure they discovered them years before that. So it's been over 20 years since we heard about these. And over the last 20 plus years, we've heard more about how they're all over the planet and we see it in seals and penguins. But it's only in the last 5 years that we've started looking in the human body. And I have this hunch that, we've thrown plastic away, but it hasn't gone to the ocean yet. It's gone to landfills. And there's probably a huge amount of plastic that's just getting into our groundwater and into our rivers and being basically repurposed into our agricultural system. We hear a lot in the media about don't use plastic bottles, avoid heating in microwaves with Tupperware bowls. Those are good advice for plasticizing chemicals when you're talking about bisphenols, phthalates, PFAS, all that stuff. That is a reality of exposure. But for microplastics, this, I could empty and refill this 10,000 times and I wouldn't be able to detect a change in the mass of this bottle. But eventually I'm going to throw it away and the entire mass of this bottle will get broken down and move into the environment as microplastics. But it'll take 10 years. What we're seeing today may relate to things that I threw away as a kid in the 1980s, 1990s. We are surrounded by these plastics, but we're not seeing the plastics from the 2010s and 2020s in our body. They won't happen for another 20 or 30, 40 years. There was a paper coming out of Columbia, I guess it was a little over a year ago. It caused a big stir. Bejan Yan, Phoebe Stapleton, others were on that paper. They introduced a great technology to the world, and it's called stimulated Raman scattering. And it allowed them to visualize very, very small plastics and quantify them. And the data was great. And what they did was they took fresh water bottles just to prove how they could take some of the cleanest water in the world and still see particles in them. The media ran amok with that for the wrong reason, right? Their thing was like, oh my God, look what's in our bottles. Like what the Columbia team didn't do was determine if there were plastics in the water that was used to fill those bottles in the first place. And so there's still conflicting evidence out there, whether there's really, especially on the nanoplastic side, whether there's really anything being shed from the fresh plastic that's substantial compared to what was already in the water system from the environment.
So, what can people realistically do today to reduce their exposure to micro and nanoplastics?
Can I say write your representatives and senators? Can we get to that? Limiting meats and eating more vegetables is probably the most realistic solution I can advise at this point. We get into this discussion so often among people within the media where we're talking about what individuals can do. That's not how we win environmental problems. Clean Air Act was signed into law in 1972 by Richard Nixon because the air pollution was really, really bad in this country in the 1950s and 60s. And there was no individual choice that was going to do anything about it. Like you could not just go to the car dealership and say, I want one of the clean cars. There weren't any clean cars. We had to have legislation that said, all y'all, GM, Ford, whoever, y'all got to put a catalytic converter on your car. That price just got passed off to the consumer, but it was a standard and it worked great. And that public policy, it reduced air pollution 95% in this country. We have really good quality air in this country. But that's how environmental policy works and can be really effective. But we need that kind of level of attention, comprehensive policy to address microplastics.
And Matt, specifically, what kind of a policy do you think that we need?
We need to address many aspects of this. You can't just keep producing. So we need to talk about caps, limits to production and use of plastics. We need to talk about the real world of recycling. Less than 10% of plastics get recycled once, which means less than 1% of plastics get recycled twice. And please keep recycling, keep trying to do this right. We need to have these behaviors in our system. But sometimes that doesn't even make it to a recycling plant. It just gets thrown into landfill or it gets shipped across the Pacific. So recycling needs to be fixed. We should recycle what can really be recycled and not play games with the other stuff. And then I have a perspective, which I know a lot of my environmental friends don't agree with, but I feel like we need to invest in waste to energy treatment plants. A lot of very modern cities around the country, around the planet, I should say, use waste to energy very effectively. Vancouver, Copenhagen, Singapore. This gets rid of the problem. It creates an economic drive to create plastics, but it solves a lot of the long-term problems. And given the politics and the economic forces involved with petrochemical industry, it might be the easy button to solve a bigger problem.
How does it work?
You burn plastics to make energy.
So
Sounds bad, but
it
we burn
does.
coal. It would offset coal. It would offset natural gas. So you would be burning something else, right? Our nation doesn't immediately need more energy. We just need to titrate over the next few decades to where more of our energy comes from the waste that we create.
But doesn't burning plastics release toxins?
Burning anything releases toxins. At a very high temperature, most everything will become carbon dioxide. We're still in the climate change. Yeah, we get to worry about that as usual with any energy source. but also elemental carbon rather than toxicants. But coal creates toxicants too, and we filter a lot of the particulate out and the sulfates are taken out. And burning of natural gas will create CO2 and other things. The other trick is if we're just landfilling, all the waste we landfill, which includes compostable things, cardboard and all that, it creates methane, which is far worse for global warming. So instead, we're just moving it to CO2. It's not a very popular idea among the plastics environmental world, but I don't know how we get away from it.
You believe that we need to limit plastic production. Are you talking about no more plastic containers, no more synthetic fibers in our clothes? What are you hoping to see that will have a real impact?
I'm actually hoping that my team's research, as well as other groups, are able to sort of pinpoint which plastics might be the worst culprits for human health, whether it's that they're more toxic or that they are more resilient and they stick around in the environment longer. If we can identify those, then that gives us sort of easy fodder to say there's these specific types of polyethylene that have highly crystalline regions that might be more durable. So HDPE, maybe that is something we should use less, and maybe we should use PVC more. So maybe there's a way we can strategize what's going to be the safest for the environment and for human health. Beyond that, just looking at hospitals, I get that IV bags, you want them sterile, plastics are a great material, but they have plastic bedpans. What's the point? A metal bedpan worked absolutely perfectly. There's no need to replace that with plastic. And there's a lot of other dumb things we do where it's single use, throw it away, and it's goofy, right? So I think there's a lot of sensible policies that can be enacted that approach it from a comprehensive level, and it's not just one-off policies about, plastic bags or straws or things like that that don't really move the needle at all. I would say limit plastic production, make recycling work, and accept when it doesn't. And the waste to energy process needs to become more of a reality, at least in regions where it's feasible. If you're in a rural region, it's just not going to work. But I think most municipalities in the US can make that happen. The other little component, once you have the framework for policy, you can improve it. One idea would be insist that all manufacturers of bottles, whether it be water bottles or detergent bottles, they have to use 25% post-consumer recycled material. That way, nobody gets to say, look at our clean bottles. They're more attractive on the shelf. You're going to buy those instead of our competitors. Everybody has to do it, and it levels the playing field. And it creates an economic drive that allows recycling to be more viable. I would limit the things that are not easily recyclable. I would limit the things that are incredibly durable in the environment and are known to break down into nanoplastics. But we start there and we invest in research, let the polymer chemists figure out better solutions and better materials. If we build innovation into policy, industry gets to move forward by creating better products for the earth and for humans rather than just being able to do things better in bulk. We just need good science to really allow us to do head-to-head comparisons of the plastics, how the plastic age will create different chemicals as they degrade. So right now, my basic opinion is let's start with the simple thing that they all add together as a single impact on the human health. I hate to be punitive, and that's part of why we haven't published a lot of this work is we're really worried about the larger blowback from big industry. But healthy agricultural practices should be rewarded. If you're committed to, and I don't know that claiming something is organic protects you, but if you're treating your animals well and you're letting them eat a lot of naturally raised foods or letting them graze on fields that weren't irrigated or fertilized artificially, then I think that's going to end up being a lower intake.
What is the one thing that you wish more people understood about plastic and human health?
One, that it's not really coming from the fresh bottles and the cutting boards and things like that. Most of the research around those topics has been really, really large plastics that you don't absorb into your body. And I guess the other thing is we're doing okay. I think there's a lot of panic around this issue. And if you look at the overall longevity in our country, it looks a little weird and bad over the past few years. But if you take out opiate problems in our country, if you take out COVID and you take out handgun use and you take out automobile accidents and alcohol related accidents, people in this country are living a very long life. We shouldn't jump to conclusions about the microplastics and the chemicals associated with them as being some scourge that are destroying our humanity and creating untoward health problems. We need to address these things rationally. We need to use sensible data moving forward with sensible scientific research, and decision making derived from those data will get us to a healthier place. The nanoplastics are really what we see a lot of, and they look visually so old that we think they're extensively degraded and aged and probably decades old. So we think that that is the bulk of what we're getting. Whereas with the wrapper, Tupperware, things like that, we just don't think they're shedding small enough plastics that you really absorb. You could eat a pill-sized plastic. Obviously, we swallow pills all the time. It will go straight through. It will not absorb into your body. It'll stay in your gastrointestinal tract and come out the backside. That said, those wrappers and those Tupperwares, they do release chemicals from the plastics. Phthalates, bisphenols, those are chemicals that are associated with health outcomes. So coming back to the comprehensive policy, there's still a lot of questions around micro and nanoplastics, where they come from, what health effects they might cause. There's not really a lot of questions about the phthalates and bisphenols and all sorts of chemicals, PFAS. We have every reason to make justifiable changes to public policy based on the research that's been done on the chemicals coming from plastics. So it's a weird place for us focusing on the particles of nanoplastic because it's new and we're just discovering things, and there's still a whole world we don't know, but that shouldn't stop us from making broader changes.
And Matt, what do you do to reduce your intake of micro and nanoplastics?
I try not to stress about it on a day-to-day basis. I try to maintain a healthy low carbon footprint. I walk to work, I've got solar panels, I compost. When I go to the grocery store, we take our reusable bags, and I don't put fruits and vegetables into individual bags. But I try not to panic about these things because I know people really do stress about it, and cortisol is bad for your health. So I hope people can make sensible decisions and not panic.
Matt, what are the three takeaways you'd like to leave the audience with today?
So plastics are going up in the environment and they're going up in our bodies as a result of that. We don't know that there are health effects from micro and nanoplastics yet, but there's some compelling evidence, and the research over the next few years will illuminate the issue pretty dramatically. And the last thing is, this is not something that individuals can win the day on. This is not an individual choice. It has to be something we address as a nation to figure out how to limit plastics, how to recycle them properly, and how to dispose of them properly.
Thank you so much for your research, and thank you for our conversation today.
Thanks for having me on, Lynn.